The city of Jerusalem, in the spring of 33 AD, held approximately 250,000 permanent residents within its walls. That was its ordinary population. But in the weeks leading up to Passover, that number swelled to between 2.5 and 3 million souls, pilgrims streaming in from every province of the Roman Empire, from Babylon and Alexandria, from Antioch and Rome itself, from tiny Galilean villages and wealthy Judean estates, all converging on a single city built on two hills in the Judean highlands, roughly 750 meters above sea level. The infrastructure could not hold them. Josephus, who lived through the final years of this city before its destruction, describes tent cities spreading across the Kidron Valley and up the slopes of the Mount of Olives, families sleeping in courtyards and on rooftops, the roads so packed with travelers that a journey of a few hundred meters could take an hour. And it was into this city, at this exact moment of maximum density and maximum tension, that the Roman governor Pontius Pilate ordered a man scourged and crucified on a Friday morning in the month of Nisan. To understand what happened to that man's body, what was done to it, what it endured and what it meant, we must first understand the machinery of Roman execution, not the theology of it, not yet. First, the machinery. Because the Romans built their punishments the way they built their roads and their aqueducts, with engineering precision, designed to accomplish a specific objective with maximum efficiency. And the objective of crucifixion was not simply death. The objective was the most prolonged, most visible, most degrading death that human ingenuity could devise. It began with the flagrum. The Roman flagrum was not a simple whip. It was a specialized instrument of destruction, and its design reveals exactly what it was meant to do. The handle was short, typically a wooden grip no longer than 30 centimeters. From this handle extended 2 to 3 leather thongs, each roughly 60 to 90 centimeters in length. But it was what was attached to these thongs that transformed a beating into a systematic dismantling of human flesh. Small lead balls, called plumbatae, were tied at intervals along the leather strips, and at the tips, sharp fragments of sheep bone were embedded and secured. The lead provided impact force. Each strike drove concentrated weight into tissue. The bone fragments provided cutting edges that opened the skin and caught on muscle fibers as the thong was pulled back for the next stroke. The Greek word that Matthew uses in chapter 27, verse 26, is phragilosos. And this linguistic detail matters enormously because the Greek language of the first century had different words for different kinds of beating. The Jewish synagogue punishment was limited by Deuteronomy to 40 strokes, which rabbinic tradition reduced to 39 as a safeguard against miscounting. That punishment used a leather strap and was administered by a religious official under controlled conditions. What Matthew describes with phragilosis is specifically the Roman flagellum, a military punishment with no stroke limit, no medical attendant, no religious restraint. The Roman philosopher Seneca, writing in the same century, called it media mors, halfway death. The punishment was designed to bring a man to the absolute threshold of death without crossing it, because the man needed to survive long enough for what came next. The scourging took place in or near the Praetorium, which in Jerusalem during Pilate's administration was most likely Herod's palace on the western hill of the city, a massive complex that Josephus describes in detail with its gardens and pools and colonnades, the seat of Roman administrative power when the governor traveled from his usual residence in Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean coast. The condemned man was stripped and tied to a low stone column or post, bent forward so that the back, buttocks, and legs were fully exposed. 2 soldiers, the Romans called them lictors, positioned themselves on either side, slightly behind the victim. The Shroud of Turin, regardless of where one stands on the debate over its authenticity, preserves a physical record that forensic pathologists have studied for more than a century. What it shows across the dorsal image is approximately 120 individual scourge marks distributed across the back, the chest, and the upper legs. The pattern is not random. The marks fan outward from two distinct centers of origin, one slightly higher and to the left, one slightly lower and to the right, exactly consistent with two men striking from alternating sides, one taller than the other, or standing on slightly higher ground. Each mark shows the distinctive dumbbell shape produced by the paired lead weights at the ends of the thongs, with linear tears radiating from the impact points where bone fragments dragged through skin. Josephus, in Jewish War Book 6, Chapter 5, Section 3, describes prisoners who were scourged before crucifixion during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. His language is clinical and devastating. He records that their flesh was torn away to such a degree that the victims' spines became visible, the bones of the vertebral column exposed through destroyed muscle tissue. The man was flayed alive. Layer by layer, the subcutaneous fat exposed and then torn, the muscle fibers shredded, the small blood vessels of the capillary beds opened by the thousands so that the entire back became a single continuous wound. You need to stand in this scene for a moment, not because the suffering is meant to horrify you, but because the physical reality of what happened in that courtyard is the foundation upon which everything that follows must rest. You are in the Praetorium courtyard. It is early morning, perhaps 6 or 6:30, and the spring air still carries the cool of the Judean night. The limestone pavement is pale in the early light. There is the sound of soldiers, the metallic clink of equipment, the murmur of a gathered crowd pressing close to the courtyard entrance. The man is tied to the post. His back is already destroyed by the time the lictors finish. A landscape of opened flesh from the shoulders to the backs of the knees, the skin hanging in ribbons where the bone fragments have caught and torn, blood pooling on the stones beneath his feet. The body enters hypovolemic shock. The circulatory system begins to fail as blood volume drops, the heart races to compensate, blood pressure falls, the kidneys begin to shut down. He is, by the clinical definition, dying, and the cross has not yet appeared. After the scourging, the soldiers stationed at the Praetorium improvised their own addition. Matthew 27 records that the entire cohort, a Roman cohort at full strength, comprised 600 men, though the garrison cohort in Jerusalem may have been a smaller detachment of perhaps 200, gathered in the courtyard. They dressed the condemned man in a scarlet military cloak, the kind any Roman soldier would have had in his kit. They wove a crown from thorns, likely the branches of the Ziziphus spinacristi, the jujube thorn bush native to the Jerusalem region, whose spines can reach 5 centimeters in length, and pressed it onto his head. The scalp is one of the most vascular areas of the human body. The thorns would have opened dozens of small arterial bleeders across the forehead and temples, adding to the blood loss already critical from the scourging. They placed a reed in his right hand as a mock scepter. They knelt before him in parody of royal homage. They spat on him. They took the reed and struck his head with it, driving the thorns deeper. This was not official Roman procedure. This was soldiers amusing themselves with a condemned prisoner. And the specific form of their mockery revealed something important about the political context. They were mocking a claim to kingship. The purple robe, the crown, the scepter, the kneeling. These are the elements of a royal investiture performed in grotesque inversion. Whatever Pilate's reasons for ordering the crucifixion, the soldiers understood the charge. This man had been presented to them as someone who claimed to be a king. Their cruelty was also their commentary. The patibulum was brought out. In the Roman system of crucifixion, the condemned man did not carry the entire cross. The vertical post, the stipes, remained permanently fixed at the execution site, driven deep into the ground and left standing between executions as a perpetual reminder of Roman authority. What the prisoner carried was the crossbeam alone, the patibulum, a rough-hewn timber of cypress or pine. Archaeological analysis of Roman-era construction timbers from the 1st century, combined with estimates from the preserved dimensions of similar beams, places the weight of a typical patibulum between 34 and 57 kilograms, between 75 and 125 pounds. To put that in a modern frame of reference, the upper range is approximately the weight of 2 maximum-sized airline-checked bags, or a large bag of concrete mix. This beam was placed across the condemned man's shoulders, and his arms were tied or lashed to it at the wrists, extending outward, so that the weight was distributed across the upper back, and the beam could not be dropped. John's Gospel contains a detail that the other 3 do not. In chapter 19, verse 17, John writes that Jesus went out carrying his own cross, and the Greek phrase is significant, hyoto, meaning by himself, for himself alone. Only John records this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that at some point along the route, the Roman soldiers conscripted a man named Simon from Cyrene, a city in modern-day Libya, to carry the crossbeam the rest of the way. The implication is sequential. Jesus began carrying the patibulum alone. He collapsed, and the Romans, who needed their prisoner alive enough for public execution, pragmatically seized the nearest available body from the crowd and pressed him into service. The distance from the praetorium at Herod's palace on the western hill to Golgotha was approximately 500 to 600 meters. That is the distance from one end of a large shopping mall to the other. For a man in full health, a walk of perhaps 6 or 7 minutes. For a man who had been awake all night, beaten at 2 separate trials, scourged to the edge of death, crowned with thorns, and now carrying between 75 and 125 pounds of rough timber on a back that no longer had intact skin. This short walk was a journey through the outermost boundary of what the human body can physically accomplish before it fails. The route wound through the narrow streets of the upper city and out through a gate in the city wall. The streets of 1st century Jerusalem were paved with large limestone blocks, worn smooth by generations of foot traffic. The walls on either side of the narrow lanes rose 2 and 3 stories high, funneling sound, footsteps, voices, the scraping of the heavy beam against stone when the condemned man stumbled and the timber struck the walls of the passageway. The morning light would have reached the street only in patches where the buildings parted. The air in those narrow lanes carried the smells of the city at Passover, bread baking in clay ovens, the smoke of wood and dung fires, the metallic sweetness of blood drifting from the Temple Mount where the first Passover lambs of the day were already being prepared for slaughter. The execution site was called Golgotha. The word comes from the Aramaic gulgulta, meaning skull. Whether the name derived from the shape of the rocky outcropping or from its grim function as a place of death remains debated, but its location is established with remarkable confidence. The site was outside the city walls, required by both Roman practice and Jewish law, and explicitly confirmed by the author of Hebrews, who in chapter 13, verse 12, states that Jesus suffered outside the gate. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has marked the traditional site since the 4th century, was long questioned by skeptics who noted that it now stands well inside the walls of the old city. But Kathleen Kenyon's excavations between 1961 and 1967 traced the line of the second wall of Jerusalem, the wall that stood during Jesus' lifetime, and confirmed that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre site was indeed outside that wall in 33 AD. The city expanded after the Crucifixion. The walls moved. The site did not. There is a detail in the Roman practice of crucifixion that most people never consider, and it reveals the calculated psychology behind the punishment. The Roman rhetorician Quintilian, in his Declamationis, states explicitly, "Whenever we crucify criminals, the most crowded roads are chosen, where the most people can see and be moved by this fear." Golgotha was not in some remote corner. It was adjacent to a major road leading into and out of the city, a road that during Passover week carried tens of thousands of travelers daily. Matthew 27 verse 39 confirms this. Passers-by wagged their heads and hurled insults. The cross was positioned for maximum visibility. The death was designed to be witnessed. The suffering was public policy. What few people realize is that we possess actual physical evidence of Roman crucifixion, not merely literary descriptions, but the bones of a man who endured it. In 1968, during construction work in the Givat Hamitivtar neighborhood of northern Jerusalem, workers uncovered an ossuary, a limestone bone box used in first-century Jewish burial practice, bearing the name Yehohanan ben Hakol. Inside, among the bones of a man estimated to be between 24 and 28 years old, archaeologists found something unprecedented. An iron nail, 11.5 centimeters long, roughly 4.5 inches, was still driven laterally through his right calcaneus, the heel bone. The nail had been hammered through the bone and into the olive wood of the cross behind it, but it had struck a knot in the wood. The hard knot bent the tip of the nail into a hook, making it impossible to extract. When the body was taken down, the nail could not be removed. They buried him with it still embedded in his heel, still attached to a small plaque of olive wood. This single artifact overturned centuries of artistic tradition and forced a complete reconsideration of crucifixion mechanics. The nail was driven not from the front of the foot, but from the side, through the heel bone. Yehohanan's arms showed no nail marks in the wrist area, leading some researchers to conclude his arms may have been tied rather than nailed, though the decay of soft tissue makes this uncertain. But the evidence from the calcaneus nail confirmed that Roman crucifixion nails were hand-forged iron with a square shaft approximately 1 centimeter wide, driven through bone with enough force to penetrate wood behind it. These were not delicate fasteners. They were construction hardware repurposed for human bodies. The question of where exactly the nails were placed in Jesus' hands has its own forensic history. Traditional Christian art from the medieval period onward depicts nails through the centers of the palms. But in the 1930s through 1950s, a French surgeon named Dr. Pierre Barbet conducted experiments using cadavers and amputated limbs. His findings were stark. A nail driven through the palm cannot support the weight of a hanging human body. The soft tissue between the metacarpal bones tears under load, and the body falls. But a nail driven through the wrist, specifically through destot space, a small gap between the carpal bones, holds firmly without fracturing the surrounding bones and passes adjacent to the median nerve, which when compressed produces excruciating pain, radiating up the entire arm. The Greek word that John uses in chapter 20, verses 25 through 27, when Thomas asks to see the nail marks in Jesus' care, does not mean only palm. Care encompasses the entire area from mid-forearm to fingertips. The nails almost certainly went through the wrists. The process of nailing a man to a cross was carried out by a quaternion, a squad of 4 Roman soldiers specifically assigned to each execution. These were not sadists or volunteers. They were professionals performing a duty rotation. They had done this before and would do it again. The condemned man was laid on his back on the ground, the patibulum beneath his shoulders. His arms were extended along the beam. The nail was positioned against the wrist, destot space, and driven through with a single heavy blow of a mallet. Then the other wrist, then the patibulum, with the man attached to it, was hoisted up and fitted into a notch or groove at the top of the stipes. Finally, the feet. Based on the Givat Hamitivtar evidence, the feet may have been nailed laterally through the heel bones, or one foot placed over the other and a single nail driven through both, depending on the method preferred by the particular execution squad. Then the soldiers stepped back and waited. Mark's Gospel records the time with precision. Chapter 15, verse 25. It was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. In the Jewish time reckoning of the 1st century, the 3rd hour was approximately 9 in the morning. The spring sun in Jerusalem at that hour is already strong. The city sits at a latitude of approximately 31 degrees north, comparable to Austin, Texas, or Cairo, Egypt. By mid-morning in April, the temperature climbs into the low 20s Celsius, roughly the low 70s Fahrenheit, and the limestone terrain reflects heat and light with an intensity that makes unshaded exposure physically punishing even to a healthy person. The man on the cross was not healthy. He had lost a significant percentage of his blood volume during the scourging. His back, now pressed against the rough wood of the stipes, was an open wound. Every movement scraped destroyed tissue against splintered timber. His arms, extended and fixed, bore the full weight of his upper body at an angle that medical researchers have calculated placed approximately 130 pounds of gravitational force on each wrist joint. The position forced the chest into a state of permanent inhalation. The lungs could fill, but the compression of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles made exhalation increasingly difficult. To exhale, the crucified man had to push upward against the nail or nails through his feet, straightening his legs enough to lift his torso and allow the respiratory muscles to contract. Then, as exhaustion pulled him back down, the weight resettled on the wrists. The chest expanded involuntarily, and the cycle began again. This is the mechanism that made crucifixion the most feared punishment in the ancient world. It was not a single act of violence. It was a machine, a mechanical cycle of agony that the victim himself powered. Push up to breathe, slide down when the legs can no longer hold, push up again. Each push drove the nail through inflamed nerve tissue in the feet. Each descent wrenched the median nerves in the wrists. The exposed muscle fibers of the back dragged against the wood with every movement, upward and downward, a sawing motion that prevented any wound from beginning to clot. The medical term for what was happening to the respiratory system is exhaustion asphyxia, the progressive inability to breathe due to physical exhaustion of the muscles required for respiration. Combined with hypovolemic shock from blood loss and the profound dehydration of a man who had not had water since the previous evening, the body was being attacked simultaneously from multiple physiological directions. There was no position of comfort. There was no moment without pain. There was only the choice: push up and breathe, or stop pushing and die. The charge against the condemned man was posted above his head on a small wooden board called a titulus, the Roman equivalent of a sentencing placard, publicly announcing the crime that had earned this punishment. John chapter 19, verse 20, records that the inscription read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," and that it was written in 3 languages: Hebrew, almost certainly Aramaic, the common tongue of the region, Latin, the language of Roman law, and Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. This trilingual inscription was not courtesy, it was communication policy. Every person passing on that crowded road, regardless of their mother tongue, could read what this man was dying for. He had claimed to be a king. Rome had answered. In Rome, in the Basilica of Santa Croce in Jerusalem, there rests a fragment of walnut wood bearing partial inscriptions in those same 3 languages, reading from right to left in the Hebrew fashion. This relic, known as the Titulus Crucis, was radiocarbon dated in 2002 to a range between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. Its authenticity remains debated among scholars, but its existence testifies to the seriousness with which the early church preserved physical traces of the crucifixion. Whether this is the actual board that hung above the cross or a later devotional copy, the trilingual format matches John's description exactly. Before the nails were driven, Mark chapter 15 verse 23 records that Jesus was offered wine mixed with myrrh, the Greek esmenismenon oinon. He tasted it, he refused it. This detail is confirmed from an entirely different direction by the Talmud, in Tractate Sanhedrin 43a, which records a Jewish custom. When one is led out to execution, he is given a goblet of wine containing a grain of frankincense to numb his senses. The Talmud attributes this practice to the compassionate women of Jerusalem who prepared and offered the drink as an act of mercy. The myrrh functioned as a primitive analgesic. It would have dulled sensation, blurred consciousness, created a buffer between the mind and the body's experience. Jesus tasted it and recognized what it was. He refused it. He chose full consciousness. He chose to feel everything. Now consider the timing. The Passover lamb, according to Exodus chapter 12, verse 6, was to be slaughtered on the 14th day of Nisan, in the period the Hebrew text calls Bein ha-arbayim, between the evenings. The Mishnah, in Tractate Pesachim, chapter 5, section 1, specifies that this slaughter began at the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In the temple, 600 meters from Golgotha, the priests would have been lining up the lambs in their thousands as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The air over the Temple Mount would have thickened with the smell of blood and burning fat and the smoke of the altar fires. The sound of the Levitical choir singing the Hallel Psalms would have carried on the wind across the Kidron Valley and up the slopes toward the execution ground. Mark chapter 15 verses 34 through 37 record that at the 9th hour, 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice. The words were Aramaic, his mother tongue, the language of his childhood in Nazareth. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? The bystanders, in the confusion and the noise, misheard him. They thought he was calling for Elijah, Eliyahu, whose name in hurried Aramaic pronunciation sounds similar. But Jesus was not calling for a prophet. He was quoting scripture. The words are the opening line of Psalm 22, written by David approximately 1,000 years earlier. And Psalm 22 contains, in verses 16 and 17, a description that stops the breath of anyone who reads it carefully. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. David wrote those words roughly 800 years before crucifixion existed as a form of execution. The Persians invented it in the 6th century BC. Alexander the Great adopted it. Rome perfected it. David described it before any of them were born. The correspondence is not accidental. It is God's signature, written across a millennium of human history, authored in a time when the very mechanism of its fulfillment had not yet been conceived by the minds of men. At the 9th hour, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, at the precise moment when the first Passover lambs were being slaughtered on the temple altar 600 meters to the east, Jesus died. The interval between the promise in Exodus and the fulfillment on Golgotha was approximately 1,446 years. The interval between the prophecy in Psalm 22 and its physical realization was approximately 1,000 years. The interval between Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14, which prophesied that the servant's appearance would be so marred as to be beyond human semblance, using the Hebrew word mishchat, meaning disfigured to the point of being unrecognizable. And the morning when that prophecy became visible on a Roman cross was approximately 700 years, and the timing of the death itself to the hour matched the Passover sacrifice to the minute. But there is more, the detail that clinches it. John chapter 19, verses 31 through 33 records that as evening approached, the Jewish authorities asked Pilate to order the Crucifixion, the breaking of the legs, to hasten death before the Sabbath began at sundown. This was done with an iron club, swung against the tibiae and fibulae, shattering the bones and eliminating the victim's ability to push upward and breathe. The two men crucified alongside Jesus were still alive. The soldiers broke their legs. Death by asphyxiation followed within minutes, but when they came to Jesus, he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Exodus chapter 12, verse 46, given to Moses approximately 14.5 centuries earlier, contained a specific instruction regarding the Passover lamb. You shall not break any of its bones. The lamb whose blood marked the doorposts in Egypt, whose death purchased the freedom of a nation, whose sacrifice was at that very moment being repeated in the temple by thousands of priests. That lamb was required, by divine command, to have its bones intact, and the man on the center cross, at the exact hour of the Passover slaughter, died with his bones unbroken. The soldiers who decided not to swing the club had no idea they were fulfilling a command given in a desert on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula nearly 15 centuries before they were born. And that, friend who is listening to me right now, that precision across centuries, across cultures, across languages, across the vast indifference of human history, that is the kind of love that does not leave details to chance. The same God who choreographed the hour and the manna and the unbroken bones is the God who knows your name and knows your story. To confirm that death had occurred, one of the soldiers drove a Roman lance into Jesus' side. John chapter 19, verse 34 records what came out: blood and water. For centuries, this detail was treated as symbolic or theological. Modern medicine has revealed that it is clinical. When a person dies of cardiac failure associated with severe hypovolemic shock, fluid accumulates in the pericardial sac surrounding the heart, pericardial effusion, and in the pleural space surrounding the lungs, pleural effusion. A lance thrust into the right side of the chest, penetrating the pleural cavity and the pericardium, would release a flow of clear serous fluid, followed by dark, partially clotted blood. The separation of blood and clear serum is a recognized post-mortem sign. It confirms that death has already occurred. John, standing close enough to see this, recorded a medical detail he could not have understood. He simply wrote what he saw. 20 centuries of medical science caught up with his observation. Luke chapter 23, verses 44 and 45 record that from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, from noon to 3 in the afternoon, darkness covered the whole land. The Greek phrase is eskotista ho helios, the sun was darkened or the sun failed. This is not a throwaway detail in the narrative. 3 hours of midday darkness over the land of Israel during the most public festival of the year, with millions of witnesses in and around Jerusalem. What is remarkable is the external corroboration. The pagan historian Thallus, writing around 52 AD, less than 20 years after the event, attempted to explain this darkness as a solar eclipse. His original work is lost, but it is preserved in a fragment quoted by Julius Africanus in the 3rd century. Africanus makes the devastating observation. Thallus calls this a solar eclipse, but a solar eclipse is astronomically impossible during a full moon, and Passover always falls on a full moon. Thallus, in attempting to provide a naturalistic explanation, inadvertently confirmed the event he was trying to explain away. The darkness happened. Even the skeptics agreed on that. At the moment of death, Matthew chapter 27 verse 51 records that the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. This was not a decorative curtain. The parquet, as it was known in Hebrew, separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum that only the high priest could enter, and only once a year on Yom Kippur. According to the Mishnah in Tractate Shekalim chapter 8, section 5, and confirmed by Josephus in Jewish War Book 5, chapter 5, section 4, this veil was approximately 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, and 1 handbreadth thick, roughly 10 centimeters. It was woven by 82 young women annually, and was so heavy that according to rabbinic tradition, it required 300 priests to handle during replacement. Josephus describes it as a Babylonian tapestry of blue, scarlet, purple, and fine linen, depicting a panorama of the heavens. This veil tore from top to bottom, not from the bottom up, as human hands pulling from below would produce, from the top down. 60 feet of woven fabric, 10 centimeters thick, splitting along its entire length at the moment a man died on a hill 600 meters away. The earthquake that Matthew records in the same verse may have been the physical mechanism, and there is geological evidence for this. In 2012, geologist Jefferson Williams published a study in the International Geology Review analyzing seismite layers in Dead Sea sediment cores and identified a seismic event datable to between 26 and 36 AD, consistent with the biblical timeframe. Whether the veil was torn by an earthquake or by something beyond the reach of seismology, the theological meaning was unmistakable to anyone in the temple who witnessed it. The barrier between God and humanity was removed. The way into the presence of God, which had been sealed since Sinai, was opened, not by human effort, from the top. The Hebrew word kafar means to cover, to atone. It is the root of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and of Kofar, the ransom price paid to redeem a life. This verb appears for the first time in the Hebrew Bible, not in a passage about sacrifice or atonement, but in Genesis chapter 6, verse 14, where God instructs Noah to coat the ark with pitch. The Hebrew word for pitch is kofar. The word for the act of coating is kefar, salvation through covering. The first time this word appears in Scripture, it describes a vessel of rescue sealed against the waters of judgment. The last time its meaning is fulfilled is on a cross outside Jerusalem, where blood covers sin. The thread runs from Genesis to Golgotha, the same word, the same motion, the same God. There are details in the crucifixion accounts that deserve to be noticed, because they are so human, so particular, that no mythmaker would have invented them. John chapter 19, verses 23 and 24 records that the 4 soldiers of the execution quaternion divided Jesus' garments into 4 parts, 1 for each soldier. This was standard practice. The condemned man's clothing was a perquisite of the execution squad, but when they came to the tunic, the chiton, the inner garment worn against the skin, they found something unexpected. It was seamless, woven in a single piece from top to bottom. The Greek is specific, hupantos ekton anothen diholu, woven from the top throughout. This was not ordinary clothing. A seamless garment required a specialized loom and considerable skill to produce. It was expensive. It was unusual. And its description in John matches, almost word for word, the description that Josephus gives in Antiquities, Book 3, Chapter 7, Section 4 of the robe of the high priest. The soldiers did not know they were handling a symbolic priestly vestment. They only knew it was too valuable to tear. So they cast lots for it, fulfilling unknowingly a line written in Psalm 22, verse 18, 1,000 years before their dice hit the limestone pavement. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Luke chapter 23, verse 34, preserves what may be the most overlooked grammatical detail in the entire New Testament. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. The Greek verb is elegion, imperfect tense. In Greek grammar, the imperfect tense indicates continuous or repeated action In the past, Jesus was not saying this once. He was saying it repeatedly. Throughout the scourging, throughout the nailing, throughout the hours on the cross, throughout the mocking and the gambling and the vinegar and the darkness, he kept saying it. The intercession did not stop. The prayer was continuous. He was forgiving them while they were killing him, and he did not stop forgiving them until he stopped breathing. Friend, there is something here that the historical evidence cannot contain and the human heart cannot fully receive. The same mouth that was gasping for air in the push-sag-push cycle of asphyxiation was using that stolen breath. That breath purchased at the cost of driving a nail through inflamed bone, to pray for the men who drove the nail. That is not a metaphor for love. That is what love looks like when it has a body and that body is being destroyed. John chapter 19, verse 39, records that after the death, a man named Nicodemus came to the cross. He brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing approximately 75 pounds. The Greek litras hecaton, approximately 33 to 34 kilograms. This was an extravagant quantity. The Mishnah, in Tractate Sanhedrin chapter 2, section 5, records that 80 pounds of spice were burned at the funeral of Rabbi Gamaliel the elder, and the text explicitly compares this to royal burial practice. Nicodemus was wrapping the body of a condemned criminal in a quantity of burial spices that signified royalty. The man who had come to Jesus by night, as John chapter 3 records, now came in broad daylight and declared by the sheer volume of his offering what he believed about the man on the cross. The body was laid in a rock-cut tomb. This was not unusual for first-century Jerusalem. The hills surrounding the city are honeycombed with tombs carved from the soft limestone, many of them featuring a low entrance, a rolling stone door, and interior burial shelves called kokim. What is unusual is what happened to the site afterward. In 135 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, determined to erase Jewish and Christian memory from Jerusalem after the Bar Kokhba revolt, built a temple to Venus directly over the site of the crucifixion and burial. He filled in the tomb with rubble, paved over it, and erected a Roman temple on the platform. His intention was obliteration. His effect was preservation. By marking the site with a pagan temple, Hadrian ensured that the Christian community of Jerusalem, and every subsequent generation, knew exactly where the tomb was. When Emperor Constantine ordered excavation of the site in 325 AD, workers dismantled the Roman temple and dug through the platform fill. Eusebius of Caesarea, who was present and recorded the event in his Life of Constantine, chapters 26 through 28 of Book 3, describes the moment the tomb emerged from the rubble as contrary to all expectation. The cave itself, the rock-cut tomb, intact beneath nearly 2 centuries of deliberate concealment. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built over it and has stood in various forms ever since. Today, beneath the convent of the Sisters of Zion, near the Ecce Homo arch along the Via Dolorosa, large flagstones are preserved bearing scratched game boards carved into the pavement by Roman soldiers. The game is called Basilinda, the king's game, and scholars have noted the connection to the mocking ritual described in the Gospels, where soldiers dressed Jesus in a purple robe and hailed him as king. Whether these specific stones date to the time of Jesus or to the Hadrianic period remains debated, but they testify to the persistent presence of Roman soldiers in this part of Jerusalem and the bored cruelty that filled the hours between duties. These men lived here. They walked these streets. They played their games on these stones. And one Friday morning, in the spring of 33 AD, their duty rotation brought them to an execution that would divide human history into before and after. The 6 hours between 9 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, this was shorter than average for crucifixion. Josephus records cases of crucified men surviving for days. The Roman senator Maecenas wrote of victims rotting on the cross. the process of decomposition beginning while the person was still alive, exposed to sun and insects and the appetites of scavenging birds. That Jesus died in 6 hours testifies to the severity of the scourging and the completeness of the physical destruction that preceded the cross. His body had been pushed past the threshold of media mors before the first nail was driven. And there is one more detail, one verse that stands in Matthew's account like a door that most readers walk past without opening. Chapter 27, verses 52 and 53. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. They came out of the tombs after his resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many. Read that again. At the moment of the earthquake, at the moment the veil tore, at the moment the centurion said, "Surely this was the Son of God," tombs broke open across Jerusalem. And after the resurrection, formerly dead people walked into the city and were seen by multiple witnesses. Matthew records this without explanation, without elaboration, without theological commentary. He simply states it as something that happened. In the city of 2.5 to 3 million people at Passover, people who had been dead walked the streets and were recognized by those who had known them. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14, written approximately 700 years before Calvary, had said that the servant's appearance would be marred beyond human semblance, the Hebrew mishchat describing disfigurement so total that the figure would no longer be recognizable as a human being. After a night of beatings, after the Roman scourging that exposed muscle and bone, after the crown of thorns, after 6 hours of the push-sag-push cycle on the cross, this prophecy was fulfilled to the letter, in the most literal and terrible way imaginable. Isaiah did not write metaphor. He wrote a medical report, 7 centuries before the patient was born. And friend, here is what I want you to carry with me into these final moments. Everything I have described, the flagrum, the nails, the physiology of asphyxiation, the archaeological evidence, the prophetic mathematics, all of it can be studied and verified and debated in the clinical light of historical analysis. But the crucifixion was not primarily a historical event. It was primarily a personal one. It was not done for humanity in the abstract. It was done for you in the particular. The same specificity that timed the death to the hour of the Passover sacrifice, that fulfilled a psalm written 1,000 years earlier to the detail of unbroken bones, that matched a prophecy of disfigurement composed 7 centuries before its subject was born. That same specificity knows your name, knows the weight you carry tonight, knows the prayers you have whispered into ceilings at 3 a.m. when you thought no one was listening. He was listening. He is listening now. And the love that chose full consciousness over the numbing wine, that used its last stolen breaths to forgive, that endured the entirety of what human cruelty could devise without once turning that cruelty back on its authors. That love is not historical. It is present tense. It is aimed, right now, at the person hearing this voice. The spring sun still rises over Jerusalem. The limestone still glows gold in the early morning light. The Mount of Olives still faces the temple platform across the narrow Kidron Valley, and the olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane, some of them carbon-dated to over 900 years old, their gnarled roots gripping the same soil, still stand in the quiet of the morning, filtering the same light through silver-green leaves. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre still shelters the stone beneath which a tomb was cut and a body was laid. Pilgrims still touch the rock. They still weep. The stones remember. The ground remembers. And the one who bled on that ground remembers you, not as a category, not as a statistic in the long catalogue of human souls, but as the specific, irreplaceable, personally known person for whom he chose the nails over the numbness, the agony over the absence, the cross over the refusal that was always always within his power. He did not come down, not because he could not, because you were worth staying. If this journey through the evidence has opened something in you, a question, a recognition, a quiet stirring that you cannot quite name, I would ask you to leave a single word in the comments. Tell me what you felt, not what you think you should say, what you felt, because I believe this material does something to the human heart that no narrator can manufacture and no algorithm can predict, and I want to hear it from you. We will walk together again soon, through another place, another moment, another layer of this ancient world where the fingerprints of God are pressed into the stone and the soil and the silence, waiting for someone to notice them. If you want to be there when we go, subscribe and stay close. The road continues, the evidence deepens, and the love that spoke from that cross has not finished speaking.